Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm John Macri, and I am joined once again by the great Nathan Jahnke. And with the 2024 regular season officially wrapped, we can now close the door on this past season and look ahead to the 2025 season. Nate, it's obviously super early, but you've put out your first run of 2025 fantasy rankings, which includes rookies who have yet to be even drafted yet. So we're going to be looking at the top 12 today and discuss some of maybe your thought process on how you're picturing the first round of fantasy drafts going here in early January. So how are you and how did you find these super early fantasy draft rankings right after 2024 is done?
First off, doing well. Kind of weird not having football on Monday night or last Thursday night. Luckily, we get back to having at least two more Monday night games, one NFL and one college over the next couple weeks. But starting to realize I have more time at Thursday nights on Monday nights and have to figure out what to do with that time. But putting together the rankings always a fun exercise doing it this early in the season, especially I think this is my second year in a row adding rookies this early on as well, just because like rookies always start off lower in people's rankings and then slowly but surely creep their way up, and I'm like, I should put them where I think they're going to end up being and not start them low and then have them slowly but surely rise. They should be where I think they are, and obviously the draft will move people up and down depending on landing spots and how early people get drafted and whatnot.
Yeah, no, I think that makes perfect sense. And it's going to be an interesting conversation, right? Because, yeah, we don't know the landing spots yet, but we know the talent. We know the potential draft capital on at least a couple of these guys. But we're going to go through the kind of the top 12 here. And there's, there might be a rookie in there. You'll have to stick around to find out and kind of break it down by position, maybe in future episodes, right? But if you don't want to wait for that, then you can head on over to pff.com and check out Nate's article on pff.com, which you can get access to with a PFF Plus subscription. And you've ranked 150 players on there, Nate. So plenty to dive into. And we're going to get right into the top 12 here. So we're going to start right at Nate's 101 for 2025. He was our 2024 fantasy MVP. He was wide receiver 1 by a mile. So Nate, you've got Ja'Marr Chase at 101 to lead us off. Tell us about what has him above everybody else right now.
Oh, yeah. First off, at wide receiver, like you said, he was a distance above everyone else, averaged nearly 5 fantasy points per game, more than any other wide receiver this season. And a big part of that is just the quarterback situation in Cincinnati. Chase isn't the highest graded wide receiver we have. He's in the top 10. He's been in the top 10 in recent years, but not at the very top. But the big difference is he has Joe Burrow throwing him the football, and other elite quarterbacks don't have the same connection with any of their receivers. Like we have Patrick Mahomes, who has an aging Travis Kelce at tight end. Lamar Jackson has a number of receivers he throws to. Josh Allen has a number of receivers he throws to. But also those quarterbacks have more of a rushing element to them, and that's part of what makes them so good, where Burrow has been the top passer. We've had our just general PFF awards going on, and Burrow won the best passer award. So the fact that Chase is an elite receiver with an elite quarterback option, and there's no other combination like that in the NFL right now, that's what has Chase number 1. The only concern is the contract situation with Chase, the contract situation with Higgins, how ugly things could get this offseason. Ideally, they both get new contracts and everyone's happy, and then they don't have money to spend on defense, so then the defense keeps on not playing well, so they keep on having to pass the ball for fantasy purposes. But that's the only thing that could change, is this offseason could get ugly, in which case Chase might not stay the number 1 overall pick throughout the entire offseason.
Man, yeah. Hopefully it doesn't, get too bad. I think he's going to get paid. I think obviously the Bengals are going to look to keep him. So hopefully there's no holdouts or anything like that. But yeah, I'm not going to disagree with him as a number 1 overall here. It was an incredible season where he was as productive as we hoped he could have been. We've seen it since his rookie season, really, but obviously stayed healthy. Joe Burrow, like you said, was elite, which played a huge part in this because, like you said, it's not like Chase's per snap metrics were like so much more dominant than like even in previous seasons for him, but it was Burrow operating at another level, playing a big part in this. And, if you look at Chase's yards per route run, 2.41, that's actually just behind his career high as a rookie of 2.44. His receiving grade, while excellent at 84.9, is actually the lowest of his career. He also had the second highest drop rate of his career at 7.3%, but he was even more involved in the offense than basically he's ever been. 171 targets, led the NFL, as did his 1,708 receiving yards, 127 receptions, 17 receiving touchdowns. He gets the receiver triple crown there. But I think, that there's an argument to be made that as an individual player on some of his per route data, there's probably room for improvement too, right? So even if those targets, receptions, touchdowns come down a bit next season, he could still perform at a high enough level where he finishes as wide receiver one again. And then obviously having an elite passer like Joe Burrow is only going to help feed that potential. So I'm with you on Chase 101 for sure. All right, let's move on to 102 next, Nate, where you have another wide receiver and one that our 101 Ja'Marr Chase is constantly compared to and linked with, both guys coming out of LSU and starting their NFL careers around the same time while dominating the league. The next pick is Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings, who finished as the wide receiver 2 behind Chase this past season. So tell us about your thought process here, Nate, of going wide receiver, maybe at the top of the draft, and then I guess Jefferson specifically.
Oh yeah, the wide receiver thing, a lot of it has to do with the consistency at the position at wide receiver compared to running back. Like the top 5 running backs from 2023 were Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, Travis Etienne, Rashad White, and Raheem Mostert. And those players did not work out very well. This year, we're at wide receiver. We have Lamb, Hill, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Puka Nacua, AJ Brown. Outside of Tyreek Hill, all of them did very well. They all did roughly the same as they did last year. Justin Jefferson had the injury, but still 20 fantasy points per game in 2023, and still was one of the top wide receivers again in 2024. And we saw other wide receivers who maybe not top 5 overall, but top 5 in points per game, of still doing well from one season to the next. And that's kind of stayed true among these young elite wide receivers. So for me, a lot of it's the consistency at the position that kept me at wide receiver for the first 2 picks. This year, Jefferson, if anything, had a down year because of the quarterback situation. Like Sam Darnold did so much better than anyone expected, but it's still not the perfect situation. There's a chance that another young wide receiver might end up ahead of Jefferson next year. A lot will depend on what the Vikings choose to do at quarterback. If they stick with Sam Darnold, which then we know Jefferson will probably do roughly the same as he did this year. If they go to JJ McCarthy, there's a chance that McCarthy could be the best quarterback Jefferson's had in the NFL, and Jefferson could have his best NFL season to come. So I think Jefferson still has upside to improve, but still is a very, very safe, even if the quarterback situation isn't great, he's still going to be one of these top wide receivers.
Yeah, definitely. Look, 18.7 PPR points per game. That was 4th among wide receivers. But if we're looking at like some of the underlying metrics again, like Jefferson, he even outperformed Chase in receiving grade, yards per route run, overall grade. So it's one of those situations where I don't think you could really be wrong with who you pick between the two, because there's an argument that Jefferson is the better player still. But for me, and it sounds like for you as well, the tiebreaker really is at quarterback, where, yes, Sam Darnold, he had a great season and one that nobody expected, but he's not Joe Burrow. And I think there's, still some doubt maybe about how sustainable Darnold's level of play will be beyond this season. I think we get a better idea of that here in the NFL playoffs, just kind of see how he holds up. But yeah, because that week 18 game against the Lions, I know just a 1-game sample compared to a strong season as a whole, but some doubt has at least been planted there. That being said, I said coming into this past year as well, like Justin Jefferson is a quarterback proof wide receiver, and he probably never should have dropped outside of that top 3 wide receivers in ADP, which he did quite a bit once it was clear that JJ McCarthy was going to be out and Sam Darnold was going to be in. But it seems like Darnold is going to remain in Minnesota, though I guess that's not official yet. I'm sure we'll discuss that when we get closer to free agency, but we should at least feel comfortable right now about the situation in Minnesota for Jefferson to thrive in. So yeah, I'm also good with him as wide receiver 2 here. Okay, our first running back comes off the board next at 103, Nate. And no, it's not Saquon Barkley, who finished as RB1 weeks 1 to 17. And probably the name that I've seen as RB1 for early 25 rankings the most so far was Saquon, though he won't be far behind. But Bijan Robinson is your RB1 for 2025 right now. Nate, tell us about what's given Bijan the edge for you right now over Saquon.
Yeah, I've seen at least a couple people agree with me so far with Robinson as the top running back, and a lot of it's been his consistency late in the season. He's been at least RB16 in 11 of his last 12 games, was consistently playing at least 70% of offensive snaps in the last 9 weeks. So early in the season, he was seeing a bit more of a split time with Tyler Algier, but over the second half of the season was that clear every down running back that we hope that he would be. A minimum of 20 touches in 8 of those last 9 games. The only exception was a blowout where they lost 38-6, where they stopped giving the ball to running back so much when they were that far behind, which is understandable. And another big thing, the second highest graded running back this year, both second highest as a runner, third highest as a receiver. So graded very well. And he's been exactly what we expected him to be. He was the top running back prospect of the past 5 or so years, and he's been playing at that level. Atlanta has that great offensive line. Hopefully a second year in that offense, and Michael Penix at quarterback can help the offense get even better and lead to even more touchdown opportunities for Robinson.
Yeah, like you said, like the start of the year, I guess was like relatively like quiet or slow, right? Because of sharing touches a little bit more with Tyler Algier. I think the first 5 weeks he was a little bit more quiet, where he was still sitting as like RB9 overall, which isn't bad, but didn't have like a single top 12 weekly finish in there. And then from that point on, he was just dominant, like you said, and it was actually like RB2 from week 6 to 18, finished inside the weekly top 10 running backs 9 times across those 12 games and inside the top 5 for 6 of them. Have to imagine, that high-end workload, it continues in 2025. Obviously, they had some success in feeding him the rock. He had 20 carries or more 7 times, all coming after week 6. Found the end zone 14 times as a runner, just once as a receiver, despite being heavily involved there as well. I think there's potential in this Falcons offense. We've talked about it, before with Kirk Cousins coming into the season. But if Michael Penix can be what we thought Kirk Cousins was going to be heading into this season for them, like it's definitely promising. I know it's a small sample size, but Michael Penix looked really good as well, especially in week 18. He had an unreal game for a rookie, even though they lost like 95.6 overall grade for that game on 40 dropbacks, 94.5 passing grade, 7 big time throws with 0 turnover worthy plays. Like, I'm definitely intrigued by Michael Penix, but Bijan I think should thrive either way, and I think he has as good of a ceiling and floor as any player at this position. So I'm with you in giving him RB1 right now. Okay, as we alluded to, Saquon Barkley is at 104 for you, Nate. RB2 in the draft right now. We kind of discussed this last episode a little bit, but now that we have an actual ranking on it, tell us what you think will keep Barkley from being RB1, though still elite here at RB2.
Yeah, first off, gets a ton of touches and is behind a great offensive line and a great offense. So that all helps Barkley be one of the best running backs in the league. The big thing is touchdowns and how many touchdowns he will get. He had 9 touchdowns of more than 10 yards last season, which is by far the most that we have seen in over a decade, since 2008. And similarly, 4 of those touchdowns were 50 or more yards, which is the most we've seen since 2012, with Adrian Peterson having his great year that year. So Barkley has historic numbers in terms of long touchdown runs, which really helped his fantasy production. If you took away the over 10-yard touchdown runs from every running back, he would be RB9 last year. A big part of that is the tush push exists, and Jalen Hurts consistently taking those touches at the 1-yard line. If the NFL outlawed the tush push and Saquon Barkley was getting those carries, even if he wasn't as efficient as Jalen Hurts last year or this past year, Barkley would have been the top running back that we've seen in several years in terms of fantasy performance. So a wide range of how things could go. Like if the Eagles decided they wanted to start giving Barkley the ball at the 1 yard line for whatever reason, then he would be the clear 101 by a decent amount. But it's because he's not getting those 1 yard touchdowns that there is concern about him, and he's not getting the same receiving work that he received when he was with the New York Giants. So that also hurts his fantasy production. So the amount of long touchdowns really helped overcome a lot of other things that were working against Barkley's fantasy value. And I do expect those to regress at least somewhat next year. Still expect him to be among the league leader in terms of long touchdown runs because of his speed and the offense in general. But I don't think it'll be quite as good as this past year.
Yeah, I think that's really fair, right? Like we don't have to like overcorrect so much that he's not a top option, even if some of that stuff, is likely to regress, because I think, for all the reasons you laid out, like he can still be great and a consistent weekly fantasy option for us. But I think, copy and pasting 2024 into 2025 can often be a dangerous game once, you work out the context as to why he finished where he did, right? Plus, turning 28, always a danger area for running backs, but he is coming off the best year of his career. So we can't doubt him very much here. And I think RB2 is a perfectly good spot for Saquon right now. All right. I want to let you know that the new year is a great time to reevaluate financial goals, not just for yourself, but for your kids. Now is the perfect time to make sure your kids are on a path toward a solid financial future. A kid's investment account from Fabric by Gerber Life is quick and simple to set up and lets you invest in their future now for education, big milestones, and more. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a kid's investment account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. Kids can invest when they're minors, but a kid's investment account allows you to invest on their behalf now, giving their investments more time to grow. It's all online, and setting up an account could take you just 5 minutes. Then you can manage your child's account and monitor their investments right from your phone. Funds can be used for nearly anything benefiting your child, from tuition and tutors to music classes. And when they're adults and out on their own, they can use the funds for anything they need. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/fantasy. That's meetfabric.com/fantasy. MEET fabric.com/fantasy. Portfolios managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors, Inc. Additional services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Learn more at meetfabric.com. All right, that is enough running backs for now. Let's get into some more wide receivers here. And the man who was basically the unanimous decision for wide receiver one heading into 2024 is not going to be that in 2025, but still very close. CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys comes in at 105. Nate, to start a bit of a wide receiver run here for you in round one.
Yeah, he had a bit of a down year this past year, both in terms of PFF grade. His fantasy points per game was also down 17.6. It was partially down because of the quarterback situation. He was averaging 18.5 with Dak Prescott at quarterback, and then after he left, Lamb wasn't performing as well. Injuries also took their toll at the end of the season. Hard to know exactly when that started, but for me, a lot of it was just his sample size over the past couple years. If you look at the past 3 years combined, second highest graded wide receiver among those with a high sample size behind Justin Jefferson. So I might be playing it a little bit too safe here with some of the other wide receivers that are below him, but just the large sample size of being a top wide receiver is there that I trust him so much that he'll continue to be a top wide receiver going forward.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. I mean, he finished, like we said, wide receiver one in 2023. Didn't quite get back there in 2024, but I think all things considered, I don't think Lamb specifically did anything to really hurt his stock all that much. He still finished as wide receiver 8 in points per game, 13th in yards per route run, 7th in target rate, but he was actually 156th in catchable target rate among all players with at least 100 routes. So he and part of that is that he had Cooper Rush for the entire second half of the season, because before that point, before Dak got hurt, he was wide receiver 4, I think, PPR overall over those first 8 games. So there's, assuming Dak Prescott's back at quarterback, they have that connection there. It's obviously an upgrade from what they were using here in the second half of the season. So I'm with you. I think CeeDee Lamb is still in that conversation among the top 3, at the very least top 5 wide receivers heading into 2025. Okay, wide receiver 4 is up next, and the 106 in your rankings right now, Nate. And I think a name deserving of being a first-round pick for the first time in his NFL career, Houston Texans wide receiver 1, Nico Collins. Nate, obviously Collins missed some time with injury this past season, but when he was on the field, he was elite. So you're willing to take him fairly early to close out the top half of this first round here.
Yeah, like he is graded very well each of the past 2 seasons. His fantasy points per game, 17.6 this past year, which was tied with CeeDee Lamb, 17.4 the year before that. And this year, like the Texans offense, even though they made the playoffs, seemed like a down year. So I think there's definitely room for improvement for the Texans offense in general, which if that happens this offseason, could move Collins up the rankings. I could see me putting him above CeeDee Lamb, for example, if things go right in the offseason. One concern if CJ Stroud had been injured for parts of this year, even though he hasn't appeared on the injury report, it seems like that's possibly why he hasn't been playing as well. And then the problems on the offensive line, which is hopefully something that can improve over the course of the offseason. I know our most recent mock draft that we have on the site has the Texans picking an offensive lineman in the first round. So hopefully the offensive line can improve, which will improve the offense in general, allow more accurate passes to Nico Collins and allow him to do his thing. But he is graded better than some of the wide receivers that we have talked about. So I think the talent is there. I think the opportunity is there. It's just how things go with the Texans this offseason could move him even higher up the rankings.
For sure. I mean, it's a shame that, Collins was injured this year as well, because he was like wide receiver 2 pre-injury. And then when he came back, he didn't quite have the same level of success. But I think a big part of that, like you said, had to do with CJ Stroud maybe struggling more than Collins was as a player, because Collins still finished with some very encouraging underlying metrics, like you said, 91.6 receiving grade. That was tied for second at the position, 2.87 yards per route run, which was third. Also a 28.3% target rate, which was also third behind only Puka Nacua and Malik Neighbors for 100 route players, but 74% catchable target rate, ranked 197th among players with at least 100 routes run. So Stroud definitely didn't have the year 2 that I think a lot of people kind of expected, though I don't think it was nearly as bad as it seemed based on kind of the dip in production and like the increase in interceptions as well. Like his turnover worthy play rate was actually down from his rookie year, 2.4% for Stroud versus 2.9% as a rookie, despite throwing 12 interceptions versus 5 as a rookie. The passing grade is pretty close. It's not a huge drop off, 77.6 passing grade compared to 79.6. Just didn't get that production, and having so many of his wide receivers injured didn't help either, right? Stephon Diggs missed a huge chunk of the year. Tank Dell obviously out for the year. Nico Collins, they all missed significant time. So I'd be betting on a Stroud bounce back in 2025, especially if they improve that offensive line and if Collins is healthy. So no Stephon Diggs likely going to be there either. Maybe no Tank Dell, also going to be dealing with that injury recovery. So he's definitely in the first round conversation here next season for me as well. Okay, next up, you guessed it, another wide receiver and another player who also missed some time due to injury this past year, but when he was on the field, dominated and was more efficient than any other player at the position. When it came to racking up yards, Puka Nacua comes in at 107 for you, Nate.
Had the second most fantasy points per game this past year at 18.8, was top 6 in his rookie season. There wasn't a huge gap between second and third and fourth and fifth and sixth in terms of fantasy points this year, but still ahead of the other wide receivers. And in terms of his PFF receiving grade over the past 2 years combined, the 4th highest among wide receivers. So everything points to a young wide receiver who has been playing this well, should probably be in the top 4 wide receivers. The only concern for me is the quarterback position with Matthew Stafford. Will be 37 next month. He had his lowest passing grade, or second lowest in the past 9 years, lowest for him in a full season in the past 9 years. So concerned that Stafford isn't quite the same quarterback he once was. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Rams stick with him for another year. They're the 3rd seed in the NFC. They salary cap wise makes sense to stick with Stafford. I'm not sure there are necessarily better options available to them this year. So I think because of the quarterback situation is probably the tiebreaker for me for why I have Nacua fifth among these wide receivers, but there's certainly a case to be made that he could be the top wide receiver next year. That low touchdown total as well is something that, like, if the Rams offense is playing better, if they had a better quarterback, ideally Nacua would be scoring a lot more touchdowns, and in which case he could very well be the top wide receiver in fantasy next year. But for me, it's just the quarterback situation puts him this low, but it's still good to see him in as a mid first round pick, which is higher than he's ever been drafted before.
Yeah, he was amazing. I mean, following up that amazing rookie season with arguably an even better one in year two. He basically took over that alpha role again in the Rams passing offense. I mean, Cooper Kupp was still involved, but Puka clearly the man to target for them. And did he ever make the most of his opportunities? Even though he missed 5 to 6 games, I think it was 6 games on the season. He led the NFL in yards per route run by a lot with 3.56. He, like you said, led them in receiving grade as well. Still managed over 100 targets again, despite missing 6 games. His 37% target rate was also by far the best mark in the league among players with at least 100 routes. The next closest was Malik Neighbors at 29.7%. So about 7 percentage points higher than anyone else. He is very much the focal point of that offense, maybe even more than any other focal point in the league. So, and like I said, he only found the end zone 4 times, which includes 1 rushing touchdown. So I think for, players going outside the top 5 in this ranking right now, like I'm with you. I think, if the quarterback situation isn't as bad as it was this year, like he very well may have the best shot, I think, from this latter half group to finish as the number 1 overall player by the end of next season if he stays healthy, because those are just some absurd numbers, even if you bake in some regression for him as well. So yeah, Puka Nacua, things are still looking very, very strong for him. Okay, we'll end the wide receiver run in the first round, at least, with this next name from North America's team, the Detroit Lions. Amon-Ra St. Brown continues to prove himself as an elite wide receiver in the NFL. 3 straight seasons now with a 90-plus receiving grade. He's earned his spot in the first round, and he was this past season, and he didn't let us down. So no reason to not believe in the Sun God once again, Nate.
Yeah, he's graded between 90 and 91 in terms of receiving each of the past 3 years, so has been remarkably consistent from that perspective. If anything, this was a down year. His target rate was down compared to last year, yards per route run down as well. I think a big part of that is just the Lions have too many options in their offense. Jameson Williams having a better season this year, and just the other options they have as well, and Detroit winning more games so they don't need to pass the ball as much. So that has all led to St. Brown's numbers not being as elite as they could be. Still the 4th best fantasy wide receiver in terms of fantasy points per game, which is the same as he was last year. So the fact that he remained 4th, even though he averaged a couple fewer fantasy points per game, kind of speaks to the weird year we had at wide receiver this season. I think part of that injuries, the last 2 guys we talked about, both dealing with injuries that cost them significant games. Other wide receivers as well, missing a lot of time. Chris Godwin, Rashee Rice having huge starts to their season that ended short with injury. So it was a down year in general for wide receivers, but the top players are still the top players at the position. So I think St. Brown probably has the worst chance of all the wide receivers we talked about of being the top overall wide receiver, just because I don't see the Lions needing to give him that volume like the other teams will need to give their wide receivers that volume. But I think he's still very safe to be a top 10 wide receiver as long as he stays healthy. So because of that, I think he's certainly worthy of being a first round pick, where other wide receivers ahead of him have a larger risk of having a worse season, where I don't think St. Brown will have that bad of a season, even if things go wrong outside of injuries, which impact everyone.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he definitely had his down games in 2024 where maybe he wasn't as involved in the offense as fantasy managers would hope. Right. Which, like you said, comes with being part of a stacked offense, which included a breakout from Jameson Williams as well. But he's still target number 1 in that passing game. And even with, I think, 6 games where he finished outside of the top 24 weekly PPR scores for his position, he still finished as the wide receiver 5 in points per game. And wide receiver 3 overall. So as balanced as that offense is, like Amon-Ra St. Brown, like still a crucial part of that offense, if not the most crucial part. And I don't think that necessarily changes in 2025. Like I said before, and you said as well, 3 straight seasons of 90 plus receiving grades. He's well established among the elite at his position. And even with a year with nearly 300 fewer receiving yards than he had in 2024, he still didn't really budge as a top option on the season. So can't see him not being in the first round conversation again this coming season. Okay, quick ad break from our friends at DraftKings. Have you played DraftKings Pick 6 yet? What are you waiting for? You better get on it. The playoffs are here and time is running out. As the official daily fantasy partner of the NFL, DraftKings does fantasy sports like no one else. Play for better payouts on Pick 6. It's super easy to get started. Select 2 or more players. Choose if they will have more or less of a stat like touchdowns, yardage, sacks, and more. Pick 6 is available in most states, including Missouri, California, Texas, Georgia, and more. And DraftKings is making it even sweeter for first timers. New Pick 6 customers play $5, get $50 in Pick 6 credits, win more cash on Pick 6. Download the DraftKings Pick 6 app and use code PFF. That's code PFF for new customers to play $5, get $50 in Pick 6 credits only on DraftKings Pick 6. The crown is yours. Gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER. Help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org in Connecticut. Must be 18 plus, age and eligibility restrictions vary by jurisdiction. Pick 6 not available everywhere, including New York and Ontario. Void where prohibited. 1 per new customer. Bonus awarded as non-withdrawable Pick 6 credits that expire in 30 days. Limited time offer. See terms at pick6.draftkings.com/promos. Okay, on to the final 4 names of your top 12 now, Nate. Wide receivers are done for now, so it's time for some running backs to make their mark a little more right now. We had a couple with Bijan and Saquon, and I think the next man has an argument to be right in there with them. Jahmyr Gibbs, also representing North America's team, the Detroit Lions.
Oh, yeah, talent-wise, he is right there. We've seen the past couple weeks without David Montgomery. He is fully capable of being the top overall running back. We've just seen discussions on Blue Sky of the very big differences between what fantasy teams want and what is good for the Detroit Lions. And for the Detroit Lions, it makes perfect sense for them to continue rolling out David Montgomery as well as Jahmyr Gibbs, so Montgomery can wear down the defenses, and then Gibbs can take advantage of the tired defenses. And it has worked for the Detroit Lions just fine all season long. And they will probably continue doing that for the foreseeable future, which is not great for Gibbs' fantasy production, which even though he is clearly one of the top running backs in this kind of offense and in this kind of rotation, ideally we would like to see him be the every down guy that we've seen him be the past few weeks, where he has been just a monster in terms of his fantasy production. So I think we will continue to see David Montgomery start games and Gibbs not see that elite volume that we would hope that he would see, but because he is in the Detroit Lions offense, which is so good, the 3 offenses that we've talked about with running backs so far all have elite offensive lines, all have running backs who have graded very well over the courses of the past couple of seasons. So I think Gibbs is very safe to be a top 5 or so fantasy running back. I just have a hard time putting him in that same group with Bijan Robinson and Saquon Barkley when he has to share the backfield with someone else.
Yeah, I mean it's a winning formula for them, right? Like they've had success either way, but if you can, mitigate the potential for injury by utilizing both backs, why wouldn't you do it? It's worked for Detroit for a few years now. David Montgomery still under contract next season, so I think he'll still be in the mix, and getting substantial touches and key touches. That's probably the thing, like you said, that holds Gibbs back from being RB1 overall, because we definitely saw that overall RB1 potential in the fantasy playoffs with Montgomery out. But either way, like, he's still dominant on shared touches, capable of RB1 numbers on any given week. He's still at 5 top 10 weekly PPR finishes with Montgomery in the lineup. Obviously was RB1 overall with him out of the lineup. So the floor is still high for him. And then there's always the potential that maybe he does get more work in 2025 anyways, even with Montgomery there. And that raises his ceiling a little bit more. Probably less likely, considering that, like I said, their success that they've had with the 2-back backfield. But I'd be very happy with Jahmyr Gibbs here in the back half of round 1. Okay, our next running back, RB4 for you, Nate, coming in at 110. Devon Achane of the Miami Dolphins. He was like a polarizing second round fantasy pick in 2024. A lot of people didn't believe in kind of that elite efficiency as a rookie. And while that did cool off a fair bit, it was the workload that increased. And he ends up with a very strong RB6 finish in points per game, basically right around where he was being drafted. So delivers for those that believed in him this past season and is in a good spot to keep that going here in 2025.
Oh, yeah. Some of that will depend on how this offseason goes. Like you said, 6th in fantasy points per game. The 3 running backs we talked about already are 3 of the running backs ahead of him. The other 2, Derrick Henry, Alvin Kamara, both will be 30 years old or older next year. So a chance both of them could regress. Also, running backs that could see more competition for touches next season compared to this season. So wouldn't be surprised if Achane can surpass both of them. But a lot of it will depend on what happens with this offense. We saw this past year Tua get injured, and when Tua was active, Achane was averaging 22.5 fantasy points per game, which would have been the best among all running backs. But once Tua was out of the lineup, Achane wasn't nearly as effective, 8.7 fantasy points per game. The offense wasn't nearly as effective. So Tua needs to stay healthy, which is part of it. And then another big part is the offensive line, where Detroit, Atlanta, Philadelphia all have elite offensive lines, have been top 10 both of the past 2 seasons. Miami had a bottom 5 offensive line in terms of run blocking this year. So ideally, they can address their offensive line this offseason. Another team where our mock draft has them going offensive line in the first round. So hopefully Miami can improve that. But in terms of just talent, over the past 2 seasons combined, Achane has the second highest rushing grade and the highest receiving grade of all running backs. So he definitely has the talent to be the overall RB1. It's just the situation in Miami isn't nearly as good as the situation for the other 3 running backs, but a chance some things can at least move in the right direction and close the gap between Achane and the other 3 running backs.
Yeah, I think that all makes sense. And I think the other interesting thing too about Achane having kind of this great fantasy season again is kind of like coming out of 2023. You could probably argue that there is some meat left on the bone where, as a rookie, it was workload that could have improved. But coming out of 2024, I think just his overall rushing could improve. And that probably comes with the offense as well, like you said, with Tua being healthy. But he averaged just 4.5 yards per carry, which is fine. And while we expected regression from the 7.5 yards per carry as a rookie, I think 4.5 was probably on the low end of that expected outcome. And then he ran for just 6 touchdowns after getting 8 in 2023 on almost 100 fewer carries. I think we can see some improvement there as well, on top of kind of meeting somewhere in the middle of his rookie and second year rushing metrics. So would hope that Miami's offense is better. I don't think that they were performing up to their potential in 2024, whether Tua was healthy or not. So, we talked about it with Jalen Waddle and obviously a down year from Tyreek Hill. So a better offense could lead to more opportunities to score as well. I like the first round ranking of Achane, even if they, continue to get guys like Mostert and Jalen Wright involved next season. Like Achane's still the clear leader of that backfield right now.
Yeah, and like Mostert wasn't getting involved at the end of the season. He just took 1 snap in the last game. Jalen Wright started losing snaps to Jeff Wilson, so I'm not too concerned about the backups. Yeah. And if there's anything we learned about running backs this year is how important the situation is with Derrick Henry, with Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs. They all change their situation and their fantasy production changes dramatically. Hopefully it doesn't take changing teams for this to happen, but hopefully an improvement in the offensive line and the health of Tua, and hopefully the wide receivers getting back to normal can all change the situation enough for Achane to be at an elite level.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen it right from this offense before. It didn't work this season for whatever reason. So maybe it was a down year. Maybe they can bounce back. But I'm with you. I think there's definitely room for them to improve. Okay, next up at 111, our very first tight end of the draft, marking a potential return to the first round tight end. Nate, we didn't have one last year after Travis Kelce was a fixture in that range, but you believe Brock Bowers of the Las Vegas Raiders makes a strong case to make tight ends first round fantasy picks again. Obviously, a historic season by the rookie has you pretty optimistic about him heading into year 2.
Oh, yeah, 15.5 fantasy points per game, which was 3rd best, but very close to both George Kittle and Trey McBride. Concerned with Kittle is that the other players in the 49ers offense will be coming back. Brandon Ayuk, Christian McCaffrey, and Kittle will be a year older. So I'm pretty confident of ranking Bowers ahead of Kittle. The big thing will be between Bowers and McBride. And a lot of this will just depend on what happens this offseason with the Raiders in general. A lot of the other players we've talked about are pretty stable in their situation. The coaching staff's remaining intact outside of maybe Dallas, but it sounds like things are heading in the same direction with Dallas at a head coach, at least. A lot of the quarterback situations we've talked about are stable. It's just the Raiders, we don't know who will be their quarterback. We don't know who will be their head coach. We don't know how this offense will look, what options they'll bring in at wide receiver, since we can expect them to at least bring in some option at wide receiver to improve the wide receiver room. So a lot can change in this offense. So that could impact where Bowers ends up being ranked. But I think we will see Bowers and McBride and Kittle all getting drafted higher than we've seen tight ends in recent seasons, just because how big of a gap there was between them and everyone else at the position. A lot of the other options that we have seen year after year at the position are getting older. Travis Kelce is going to be a year older. Mark Andrews a year older. TJ Hawkinson hasn't quite returned to form and will be a year older. So we really haven't seen the consistency at tight end that we've seen in recent seasons, but Bowers and McBride seem to be the two that we can trust a little bit more going forward. Even like Sam Laporta is someone who we thought would continue to do great things in his second year. And like the other Lions players that we talked about, it's just there's too many weapons in Detroit that I think Sam Laporta is kind of right up there with tight ends, but I think it's hurting Laporta more than it's hurting Gibbs and St. Brown of being in this offense with so many good players. But I think we've seen tight ends, you need to draft at least a top 12 option. Basically, I think it was 9 of the top 12 options last year in terms of ADP ended up in the top 12 in terms of fantasy points per game. So tight ends are the most consistent in terms of who you draft high and who ends up playing well. But there's becoming a bigger and bigger gap between the top of those 12 and the bottom of those 12.
Yeah, it makes sense. Like I'm with you. I love Brock Bowers. I think he's going to be an elite fantasy asset here for years to come. I definitely think there's a world where he's worthy of being a first round pick. But yeah, I'm with you. My only concern as well, same thing. Like we don't know what the Raiders quarterback situation will look like in 2025. And it's not an exactly, a great year for them to kind of easily improve that situation either. They're not really in a great position to get one in the draft at 6th overall, and free agency is going to be fairly barren. Now, Bowers proved that, he can be elite with bad quarterback play already. So I don't think that's the biggest issue. I just wonder if he'll be better suited as like a second round pick versus a first, if we're getting, maybe somebody like spoilers for names that aren't in the first round here, Malik Neighbors or an AJ Brown who remains elite. Maybe people will argue for a CMC resurgence if early reports are that he's healthy and ready to go. Who knows what's going to happen there. But yeah, the other part of it, like you said, it too is, we can bake in some potential improvement from Bowers, but how much better can he be than, some of the other tight ends to separate himself and be worthy of a first round pick? I don't know, especially considering, like you said, Trey McBride being the biggest contender there, right? Like if I can get Trey McBride in the second round, that's obviously the better value, but still love the potential of Bowers. But yeah, it's just the Vegas offense and the coaching staff, who knows what it's going to look like, right? There's a lot more question marks, I think, with him than some of maybe the other potential first round picks. But I'm not completely against it. I don't mind it.
And I would say while the question marks are there, I don't know what would be worse options at coach and quarterback than what we saw this past year. Like the problem would be is that we bring in an offensive mind who favors wide receivers or throwing to running backs or really likes the run game. Like if you get a offensive mind like we've seen in Baltimore or San Francisco who wants to run the ball over 50% of the time, they invest heavily at the running back position. and therefore there aren't as many targets to go around to get to Bowers. But like, even though this isn't a great situation for quarterbacks, it's going to be better than what we saw last year. Like, even if they brought in Daniel Jones at quarterback, for example, it's not the best option at the position, but it's probably still an upgrade to what we saw. Like in Atlanta this past year, Kirk Cousins was at quarterback. He didn't do nearly as good as we thought he would do, but he was still a significant upgrade to what Atlanta had the previous year at quarterback, which helped the wide receivers in the offense, which helped the run game in that offense. So even though there's question marks there, if anything, it's worst case scenario, it's something similar to what we saw. Best case scenario, hopefully it's something better. Outside of the worst case scenario, if they run the ball more, they invest in wide receivers, they throw the ball to wide receivers more. But I would think any offensive mind they bring in would understand Bauer's talent and get him the ball.
Even if that offensive mind is Arthur Smith, who we thought the same thing with.
Okay, if Arthur Smith, then I'll have to look a little bit closer at how good Bowers was as a run blocker and then go from there.
Oh, God. Let's hope not. Let's hope. Let's just continue to hope for Brock Bowers' excellence. I'm all for it. All right, final pick of the first round, according to Mr. Nathan Jahnke. We mentioned how rookies are included in Nate's ranking. So, Nate, you're a believer here in rookie running back out of Boise State, Ashton Jeanty. So, for those of us who haven't dived into this year's incoming crop of rookies, tell us about what's got you believing in Jeanty in the NFL and for fantasy, because, we don't know the draft capital or landing spot just yet, but certainly looks promising heading into this year's class.
So we have him fourth on our big board, which is the highest that we have ever had a running back on our big board. Part of that probably due to positional value and us trusting running backs a little bit more after this past season. But Bijan Robinson, Dalvin Cook, Ezekiel Elliott, the only other running backs in the past decade that we've had ranked in the top 10. Even in consensus big boards, the consensus is slightly lower on him, but still have him as a top half of the first round pick. Other running backs that have been picked in the top half of the first round, the three that I mentioned, Jahmyr Gibbs, Leonard Fournette, Christian McCaffrey, those are the running backs that have been picked in the top half in the past decade. All running backs that I've mentioned here have either been top 10 in fantasy points over the course of their entire rookie season or over the course of the second half of their rookie season. So some of them took a little bit of time within the rookie season to really get going, but all of them were able to do so at least at some point during their rookie season. And Jeanty's someone that we have ranked higher than we've had any of those other running backs ranked. So we don't know where he's going to go, but any team that's going to draft him, I would expect them to feature him heavily in the offense. The by far consensus is he ends up with the Dallas Cowboys, probably the biggest player to team landing spot that I've seen in mock drafts in general so far. Maybe a couple other players like that, but there's been a ton that have Jeanty going to the Cowboys, in which case the offensive line is strong, coaching staff that has given the ball to a running back a ton in the past. We've seen Ezekiel Elliott have elite seasons in this offense. We've seen Tony Pollard maybe not get the volume we like, but have been very good in this offense when he's healthy. At least had the very good second half of a year ago once he got healthy. So we've seen Cowboys running backs thrive in the offense before, and Jeanty would arguably be better than what we've seen at the running back position. So I think that is a very clear top 5 potential situation. But even other teams, a little bit will depend if the offensive line is bad enough that could move Jeanty down some, or if there is significant enough competition at running back. But I think there are enough landing spots where a team is in huge need for a running back upgrade. The Raiders for sure need a running back. I think the Cowboys and the Browns are also up there in teams that could insert a running back and have a ton of fantasy potential in general. And then plenty of teams where the top running back is a free agent this year. Dallas, Minnesota, the Chargers, another one. So a couple of teams where Jeanty could be in a very run-first offense and thrive, especially if he falls down the draft a little bit to some of these better teams.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was looking at Trevor's mock draft, and he has Jeanty going to the Cowboys there at 12, like you said. So many people do, and I was listening to Connor and Trevor on the Stock Exchange podcast doing their mock draft as well, and then Trevor even pushed him up even earlier. He had him going to the Raiders. So two good landing spots, I think, for Jeanty. And like you said, if somebody's drafted him this high, they're going to be featuring him. And for anybody that doesn't know it, and even for me, because I haven't done all my rookie research yet, I don't usually start until January, February, and we'll definitely be covering that at some point as well. So even for me, as someone who doesn't follow college football, like, it's impossible to ignore the hype around Jeanty this season. He posted a 96.6 rushing grade in 2024, which is the highest mark ever among FBS running backs with at least 25 carries in a season. He earned 2,595 rushing yards most of the past decade. He scored 29 rushing touchdowns, second most in a season behind Devin Singletary's 32 back in 2017 with FAU. 5.3 yards after contact per attempt is a top 10 number over the past decade among FBS running backs with at least 100 carries in a season. 0.40 missed tackles forced per attempt is top 12 among that same cohort. He did all this despite getting just 1.7 yards before contact per attempt, which is a very low number, by the way, and speaks to his kind of O-line being able to block for him. So he wasn't like this elite offensive line merchant either. Like, he's earning those yards himself, as only 24.1% of his rushing yards this season came before contact, which was the 13th lowest mark among all FBS running backs with at least 100 carries. So there's no doubt that he's elite. There's a reason that he's as high as he is on the big board. One of the best players in the draft, obviously. So wherever he ends up being, I think there's potential for him being a first-round pick in fantasy. Probably going to depend a little bit on landing spot. I think Dallas is probably the best one, like you said, where I think people would be pushing him into that top 12. A lot of hype right now, so I wouldn't be surprised to see him a top 12 pick coming out of the NFL draft, especially with that landing spot. So this will be a fun one to monitor for sure.
Yeah, and speaking of like the highest grades we've seen out of college, we saw Brock Bowers have the highest receiving grade for a tight end we've seen in our decade plus of grading, and we saw that play out in his rookie season. Jaden Daniels, the best rushing quarterback we've seen out of college, and we saw that play out in his rookie season as well. So it's nice to have over a decade of this college data now, although it makes me feel old knowing that it was a decade ago that I was grading the college games when we were first doing college. So it's been a while since we started doing college.
Yeah, nice. We got a decent sample size here, and we'll dive into the rookies a little more closer to the NFL draft, and once we get free agency behind us and stuff like that. But this was fun, Nate. This is that's going to do it for this episode specifically. Like I said, we're last week we're down to one pod per week, but we'll be back next week and covering top 12 of a certain position. We haven't figured out which position yet, but we'll figure that out in the week, and then bring that to you and bring some more early 2025 discussion as we lead into free agency and the NFL draft as well. So Nate, thank you for putting this 150 players together here and our top 12. This is always a fun exercise, especially in early January as we cope with the season being over.
Yeah, it was fun, and I'm guessing we'll do running backs because I'll be writing more about running backs. Okay. So running back sounds like a good one to do next week, and we'll probably go position by position, maybe get some dynasty stuff in as well before we get to free agency, which is only like 2 months away.
Yeah, we're almost there. So thanks for everybody for tuning in, and enjoy the NFL playoffs. We'll see you next week, and until then, peace out.